today and on Thursday, we'll talk about strategies for social change as we see them in the Israeli Halachic feminism. We'll talk about religious feminism and specifically Halachic feminism. We'll see what that is in a minute. We'll talk about the activists and the strategies they adopt and use. And we'll talk about Israeli law and what role it plays in the Orthodox women's struggle for equality. In a nutshell, I'll try to argue that the strategies used in the halachic feminist struggle in Israel, they are multi-faced and are dialectic with one with another, something that can be seen only by looking at the struggle as a whole, rather than each activity on its own. This may sound cryptic now, but I promise that by the end of the next session, the second session, you'll see exactly what I mean. So as Marlene said, since there are many of you, we can't open the floor for discussion, but if you have any questions or comments, please write them down. And every once in a while, I'll ask Marlene to read them out loud, and obviously I'll address them. Okay, let's start. Since the development of the idea of feminism and until the 1980s, feminism and religion were considered an oxymoron. From a feminist perspective, religion places at its basis a patriarchal social arrangement that contradicts all feminist perceptions. Its religion in its own way sees a fundamental difference between the sexes and attributes them to a different status manifested in different duties and rights. And we have many examples for that. Theologically, the figure of God is presented as male. The language God talks and being talked to is that of male to male. The religious priests and prophets are almost all men, all this implying that the man is the central human figure in religion. In practical terms, women are deprived of rights in law, in personal status, in property, in rituals, and in spiritual leadership. In the personality aspect, the woman is portrayed in a variety of negative images, which have created and endorsed the laws, the halachot concerning women. She is weak, she's dangerous, she's submissive, she is seductive, she's a girl and she's a rebel, she's wise and she's deceitful. And this combination between the sacredness of tradition and the way in which women's inferiority is rooted in religions, social structures, symbols, rituals, have led feminists to reject tradition. And not only that, but to call for the abandonment of the culture, the religion, and the psychology that was created in a patriarchal context. So according to feminist literature, from a feminist point of view, a feminist woman cannot be religious. And if she still chooses to be religious, her feminist consciousness is deficient or is in constant conflict. I remind you that's the state of mind until the 1980s. Some still think that. But on the other hand, from a religious point of view, religion reflects an eternal divine truth, a truth that is not changeable by new theories such as feminism. For example, the response of the Jewish Orthodox movement to Enlightenment and to the Reform movement in the 19th century was to strengthen and even sanctify conservative attitudes, which culminated with the creation by the Khatam Sofer of the general principle, Chadash Asur min Torah, meaning all that is new is forbidden by the Torah. Or in other words, any innovation in tradition, whether to ease or to aggravate, should be rejected. Now, between these two perspectives, the feminist and the religious, were lives of real people. Religious women who started with time developing a feminist consciousness and recognizing the growing gap between their public lives, defined by equality, usually, and their religious lives defined by discrimination. And as a result, from the 1980s, a new and unique category of religious feminism evolved. And it was both in literature and really in practice. And this category sought to balance or bridge the inherent conflict between feminism and religion. And it had diverse strategies. So let's go through some of these strategies. The first strategy is adapting feminism to religion by reinterpreting feminism. So, religious feminists who accepted gender inequality and considered it part of God's will interpreted feminism to fit their beliefs. So, for example, Islamic feminists would say that the religious mandated attire, the veil, for example, the modesty requirements, keep them safe and even liberates them, especially as we look at women's body image in Western society. In their view, wearing the veil does not overpower them, but the opposite, releases them and allows them freedom, including freedom of movement. So the feminism they portray see religious choice as a feminist activity that reflects female autonomy and women's choice. So the first strategy would be I'm choosing religion, but I want feminism, so I'll reinterpret it. The second strategy is the exact opposite. I'm choosing feminism and then I'm reinterpreting religion. So the second strategy is adjusting religion to feminism. For example, Jewish feminists that interpreted halacha creatively using halachic concepts such as kvod hatzibur, which is public respect or dignity. And if once public dignity dictated that women are excluded from most religious rituals, nowadays it demands their inclusion. So we have two strategies, one opposite for each other, and they're both choosing one of the values and preferring it on the other. The third strategy takes these two values and separate them. Is separation between feminism and religion, like compartmentalization of two independent identities that are not necessarily balanced. So these women have two separate identities, a religious identity within the religious community and a feminist identity outside the religious community, in their family, in their public activity, in their work. For example, modern Orthodox women in North America tended to live a secular, or let's say modern life that included occupational progress and integration into wider society, while at the same time devoting themselves to religiousness and the religious community during the Shabbat. And so they moved between these two worlds, the religious and the non-religious, and Shabbat constituted a link between identity and time. So we have three strategies, right? One of them preferring religion, one of them preferring feminism, the other separating the two. And now the last strategy I want to talk about is a strategy that is perhaps the most complex, but for me personally is my favorite. And it involves establishing a religious feminist identity. The researcher Galiti and Iventura called this religious feminist without a dash. And what it means is having a mutual commitment to religion and feminism, in which the premiere of one of these identities over the other is constantly shifting between the various issues, frequently changing its focus. This approach sees the establishment of a religious feminist identity as a dialectical process of creating a new identity that is not dichotomous, not one way or two way, but a multi-dimensional identity in intimate and subjective ways that does not depend on the dichotomy between feminism and religion, but by the constant translation of reality in which religion and feminism are used as means of action and the decision to act. So according to this approach, religious feminist identity is not a subcategory of feminism or of religion. The dialectic between feminism and religion changes the meaning of both categories together and creates a new theoretical category that is a religious feminist identity. Okay, now that we understand religious feminism, I want to say a few words about halachic feminism. When I'm saying halachic feminists or feminism in Israel, I'm talking about the group or the movement who has emerged and operates among the population recognized in Israel as religious Zionism, okay, the Tzionut Datit, which currently accounts for about 20% of the Israeli society. I won't be talking about the pluralistic streams since their struggle in Israel is completely different. These streams are a minority in Israel and they seek recognition from the state, whereas Orthodox women are part of the majority really in the sense that Orthodoxy is an established religion in Israel, and they seek recognition and they fight both in their own religion and with the state. And actually, the nature of the struggle for recognition is also very different because, again, Orthodoxy is recognized as the established religion in Israel. So theoretically, it should be easier for Orthodox women to get recognition, but still they have to fight that their feminist interpretation be accepted by the state. So our sessions involve Orthodox Halachic feminists that are part of a religious Zionism, of the religious Zionism in Israel. Another note, in Israel, in recent decades, there have been trends of separation within the religious Zionism into two main groups, the modern Orthodox, the modern Orthodox and the national ultra-Orthodox, which are called in Hebrew Charediyut Leumit, Chardaliyut, Datiyut Toranit. And in North America, the group that we are talking about would be called the modern Orthodox. So we would call them the modern Orthodox feminism. And some people in Israel do refer to them as such, but it seems to me that in the Israeli reality, this term is not good enough since it excludes the feminist activity done by the conservative stream of religious Zionism, by the Chardalim, okay, the national ultra-Orthodox. And also, I think this is a very fitting expression, halachic feminism, since it expresses the essence of this group. It reflects the two forces controlling and competing in this group's identity, feminism and halakha. Halachic feminists promote a feminist worldview, and at the same time, they are committed to halakha and operate within it. So let's talk about halachic feminism, both conceptually and in terms of its development as a movement in Israel. So the inferior status of women in the Jewish religion was anchored in the Bible and became soundly established in the Mishnah, Talmud, and rabbinic tradition. In the Bible, it was women's ritual, political, and economic status that was generally inferior to that of men. In the Mishnah and Talmud periods, male hierarchy and supremacy was related, and that's an important fact, it was related to the fact that men were obligated to study Torah and follow more commandments, more mitzvot than women. So these more commandments imposed on men, and whether they followed it or in practice or not, but these more commandments gave them legal rights, while women's lesser obligations deprived them of rights in many areas. Moreover, the larger religious responsibility of men was translated in legal terms into greater value, and the lesser responsibility of women served as a justification for reducing the value of women. According to the rabbinic sources and tradition, women are excluded from Torah study, the main religious activity in Judaism. In addition, women are deprived of the right to lead. They cannot serve as dayaniyot, religious judges, and they can't even give testimony in rabbinical courts. And because of arguments of violating the public respect of dignity, the remember kvod hatzibur and modesty requirements, they are also excluded from community leadership and public ritual. This inferiority of women in the Jewish tradition is not limited only to the public sphere, although Jewish tradition celebrates the role of the woman in the home. This role does not hold independent rights and privileges for her. For example, men are officially the heads of the family. The commandment of pro urvu, to procreate, to bear children, is considered the duty of men only. And legally speaking, the responsibility of raising and educating children rests solely with the father. But perhaps the most obvious manifestation of women's subordination within the family are the halachic laws of marriage and divorce. We'll go into them in depth later in the session. So today, thanks to an improvement in the status of women in the wider society, many of these halachic restrictions are matters of theory only, and they do not affect women's lives in practice. However, when we turn to religious life, the man is the representative Jew, and women are, for the most part, objects rather than subjects. And the role and value of women is determined and limited mainly by the interests and considerations of the man. Prayers are formulated with reference to men only. And women's opinions do not appear in traditional sources. Furthermore, Jewish sources dealing with women were written by men, reflecting stereotypical perceptions of men towards women. And at the end of the day, religious women in the modern world, in public life, they are property owners in their religion, in their religious lives. Okay, do you hear me now? Let's see. Okay, better is good. So, as opposed to that, good. As opposed to that, if their religious lives, again, at least in the Orthodox world, choice is taken from them, they are excluded and discriminated against. For these reasons, and we turn here to the conceptual challenge, for these reasons, the challenge posed by feminism to Orthodox halachic law is a challenge that goes to the root of the human experience. As Tamar Ross teaches us, this challenge relates to religious attitudes and principles that define our overall view of ourselves, the nature of human sexuality, of family, of society as a whole. Tamar Ross is a central theologist in Orthodoxy Judaism. We need to understand that the theological justification for the authority of the halachic framework is based on two related assumptions. The first is that the written Torah originates in God and therefore it cannot be changed. Moreover, every word and every letter in the written Torah carries divine meaning. The second assumption is that the Talmudic scholars are the only legitimate commentators of this Torah. Feminism challenges these assumptions and therefore is seen as undermining the deepest roots from which rabbinic Judaism derives its validity, its authority, and its very existence. So changing the Orthodox religious system has a significant weight. Jewish law is not only a legal method, but it is also a guiding framework, culturally and normatively. The concept of halacha derives from the nature of the Jewish religion as a religion that encompasses all aspects of life for the individual and society, and therefore the norms of behavior that it dictates has a decisive influence on the cultural and the normative character of the Orthodox society. I won't get into the question of the scope of the influence of these behavioral norms on the public, but I want to illustrate two levels in which there's no doubt that religious norms are extremely influential. The first level, obviously, is that of the believers or the followers of halakha, and it doesn't really matter right now. There are different levels of adherence, if they are traditional or if they are devout. And the second level, and here's where we're looking at Israel, is the level of the state that incorporates religious norms as legal norms under the framework of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. Obviously, I'm talking about Orthodox religious norms. under the framework of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. So it was against this backdrop that halachic feminism was established in Israel. And it developed in two stages. In the first step, from the 1970s, the conceptual basis of halachic feminism was laid with the development of the evolution of Torah studying by women. And by the way, it was with mutual activity of Israeli and Anglo-Saxon religious men and women. And following the success of the conceptual move, and based on the activity of these new religious scholar women, in the second step, the halachic feminist struggle gained momentum with the establishment of Kolech organization and an increase in activist activity. And this took place in the 1990s as part of the rise in Israeli civil society's social activity and as a result of the influence of religious feminism in the United States, both Orthodox and Reform and Conservative. Okay, so that was a long but needed introduction. What we are going to do now is study about the character of halachic feminist activists and their activism, and about the strategies they use, and we'll take some case studies. So let's do something like this. We'll go through social criticism, and then if we have any questions or comments, I'll take them. So if you have something to say, you know to write it down. And after that, we'll move on to the strategies of affirmation and transformation. So I want us to open the first source. I think I'll share the sources just so that we'll be on the same page. Okay, just 1 second. We'll go to the first source, which is, just a second, Proverbs 27, that says the following: better is open rebuke than love that is hidden. Faithful are the wounds of a friend. What King Solomon tells us here is that we are far better off hearing criticism, and even when it hurts, and it hurts, when this criticism comes from a friend, from someone who cares about us, we should embrace this hurt, these wounds, because these are faithful wounds. And that's exactly what halachic feminists do, the wounds of a friend. Religious feminist women, especially activists, enter the struggle as connected critics, meaning they criticize society as a part of it and out of commitment to it. This term, connected critic, was coined by the prominent political theorist Michael Walzer, and for me, this is really a key term in understanding halachic feminism. So let's talk about social criticism. In most of the 20th century, when people thought about social criticism, they had in mind an image of a lonely, disconnected social critic. Think of Jean-Paul Sartre. According to this position, the critic must be distant from the social situation, both emotionally and intellectually, and rely on universal principles so that his voice and vision be pure. We see this image also in the writing of Edward Said, who portrays an exiled, oppositionist, and lone social critic. And according to Said, a sense of loyalty to society is the greatest threat to criticism. Faced with these notions, Walzer argued that criticism should be made from within by men and women who are committed to the society whose norms they criticize and care about its future. He felt that criticism as a social practice was not possible in the absence of loyalty or an affirmative sense of intimate connection with the criticized society or its members. Think of the prophets of Israel, of George Orwell, of Gandhi, of Montesquieu. These and many others throughout history were connected critics. Now, let us think together about the characteristics of a social critic. Let's take a look at source number 2, Jonathan Ellen's The Situated Critic, Rorty and Walzer on Social Criticism. And here it is. Okay, so the critic's location in a particular society is therefore not destructive of critical vision, as some have feared. Rather, we might better regard it as enabling, as providing the critic with access to a rich vocabulary of criticism. And the deployment of this vocabulary is likely to be more effective than appeals to abstract principle or detached expressions of dismissive condemnation or alienation. Meaning, this is not only about what's normatively better, but also what's practically better. Walter tells us that being part of society enables our criticism because we know society's language. We'll know which value to use much better than someone outside of society talking about an abstract principle society might not share or even agree upon. You know, this reminds me of a really seminal paper I read a few years ago by Nissim Calderon. And he asks about Israel. I mean, it's about Israel, but I reckon we can see it in other places too. He asks, how come the people who are in the most need of human rights and its protections are the ones who reject them fiercely? And one of the examples he gave was the social protest in Israel a few years ago, a protest that was about food prices and housing, living costs, but because it used the language of human rights and was led by people who were identified by the political left. This protest was seen as extremely sectorial, and most of the population that suffer from high living costs in Israel not only did not participate, but wholly rejected this protest and this movement. And Calderon's trying to understand this phenomenon, and he realizes that the universal principles of human rights, the principles and language used by the leaders of this protest, are conceived as a threat on a lot of people's identity, on particularism, on community, on their sense of belonging. The social protest was seen, rightly or not, I don't want to get into this now, but the protest was seen as the outside critic. And that's why it failed in garnering broad support. And Walter tells us that we need to be very attentive to the language of our criticism. And this is not only strategy, it's a substantive point. That's the right thing to do according to Walter. Let's go back to our source. I'm skipping one paragraph. Okay. Walter's argument seems to be based on one, a concern for political effectiveness and motivating capacity, and two, a pluralistic and democratic fear of moral absolutism. These concerns fit very well with his sense that social criticism is part of any dynamic cultural life, and specifically with the maintenance of active democratic participation. As he writes, social critics are most of the time members speaking in public to other members who join in the speaking and whose speech constitutes a collective reflection upon the conditions of collective life. I just love this paragraph. Let's read it again. It's beautiful. The social critics are most of the time members speaking in public to other members who join in the speaking and whose speech constitutes a collective reflection upon the conditions of collective life. Social criticism is part of the activity of cultural elaboration and affirmation, where the politics of the society rests on the consent of its members to abide by its founding principles. In other words, where it is either a covenant society such as ancient Israel or a consent-based modern democracy. Social criticism plays the vital role of testing the legitimacy of the political order and reactivating the allegiance of the citizens to its constitutive principles of justice. So this social criticism is really a way for society to develop, to move forward, be better while still remaining true to its identity and principles. Remember this when we'll turn soon to halachic feminists. So That's wonderful, right? Connected critics are both the right way to conduct criticism in society and the most effective way. But there's just one small problem here. The same problem that brought us the outsider critic in the first place. Because there is a concern that the same enabling connection to society, when the society is one with moral failings, this connection will blind the social critic and will lead her to ignore the general, universal context. Because if I'm loyal to my society, I might be blind to its failings, to the suffering of others that my society is responsible to. And if that's the case, what's my criticism good for? So Walter acknowledges these concerns and somewhat answers them. According to Walter, the starting point of the connected social critic is in accepting the moral vocabulary of the elite. Yes, accepting it. This moral vocabulary of the elite in society, but over time, the critic will shift society's moral vocabulary to a whole new direction. So internal criticism, according to Walter, is conservative and limited only at the beginning and only by the fact that its radicalization is gradual. But the radicalization will happen. So let's go back to our text. Walter concludes, I need to go. Wait a second, sorry, where is it? Walter concludes here, we're here, okay? Walter concludes that criticism does not require us to step back from society as a whole, but only to step away from certain sorts of power relationships within society. It is not connection, but authority and domination from which we must distance ourselves. So Walter really tells us that this problem that we just stated, that's not a problem of connection. That's a problem of authority and domination. So to sum it up, the location of the critic as part of society allows her to access a rich vocabulary, which we presume is more effective than appeals to abstract principle or detached expressions of dismissive condemnation or alienation. Now, our activists, halachic feminists, are connected critics. For them, their loyalty to religious society and culture is the starting point and the basis for their identity. The researcher, social scientist, Tanya Tzion-Waldoks, call their activism devoted resistance, which is beautiful because it means that these women criticize their society precisely because they are dedicated to it, okay? Devoted resistance. Their activism, their striving to change is motivated by their immersion in the culture, in the religion, in the society in which they live. They are resisting because they are devoted. So I think we're gonna stop here and see if we have some questions or comments. Marlene, do we have something or no?
Yes, we have 3 questions. So I think if you want to look in the Q&A and read them yourself, they're not that many, and you might be able to combine them better than I can.
Okay, so let's see. I'm stopping the share because I can't see otherwise. When do you think women will be seen as equals in Israel? I gave my orthodoxy in the 80s because of just, yeah, I was equal everywhere, but in my spiritual life. Now I'd like to move back to Israel, but fear I can't find a community that is spiritual and inclusive. I have tons of what to say to this. And I think, but I really think that the continuation of the session will be a great illustration that would answer that, because equal is a tricky term, because are women equal in liberal society? No. So I would ask myself if you're talking about equal or about participation, or again, I have tons of what to say to that. And I would like for you to ask me again this question in the middle of the next session. See if you want to ask me this question in the middle of the next session. What has led us to believe that, thank you for your questions, everyone. What has led us to believe that reinterpreting the practice of Olah, the Beis Yaakov movement, yeah, or the veil example you gave, and empowering while not new is a kind of it is due to legislation being created, interpreted by men. Okay, so yes, there is certainly an argument that says, okay, this is extremely apologetic, and this is not a real change. And again, in like 10 minutes, we'll talk about the strategies of change. But in a nutshell, right now, I'll say that we have one strategy that says, okay, I'm not going to be at all apologetic. I think that they're unequal, and I want to ruin everything and build something new. And the second strategy says, okay, I need to work gradually. So in that case, my heart may be long gone, but my practice, what I'm doing, would be much more gradual. And yes, part of the reason is because legislation is being created and interpreted by men, but not anymore. We see a gradual change in this. And again, we'll see these examples as we move forward. Many Orthodox women who are clearly feminists, but I'm not sure they would refer. Oh, that's excellent. I'm not sure they would refer to themselves as feminists. Is that common? So that's really such a good question. When I did my research, this research in the university, at first I used the term gender equality, because I said, well, some of these women, especially the ones in the ultra-Orthodox, the national ultra-Orthodox society, they just don't want me to call them feminists, and that's a problem for them in their own public, and perhaps even they don't see themselves as feminists, but they are change agents. And whether or not they call themselves feminists, I think it depends on what definition we give to feminism, or each and any one of us. And I don't want to open that, but even the term feminism is not accurate, because there are feminisms. There are many feminisms, and I think a wide variety of women can relate to the different perceptions of feminism. But there is a problem in the public, especially in conservative publics, with the term feminism. So sometimes it's strategy, not calling themselves feminists, and sometimes it's really true to their own agenda. What does this kind of feminism say about lesbianism? Oh, that's an amazing question. I'm not sure I can answer. I will say that Halachic feminism deals with LGBTQ and their acceptance in society. It is very accepting as a whole to religious LGBTQ. Those who resist within a society may not be seen as devoted to the society. So this decision will be lost on those who are in control. What do you think about the effectiveness of devoted resistance? So that's so true. That's so true. And we'll talk a lot about the effectiveness of this devoted resistance. I think that most of what we'll talk about is the effectiveness of devoted resistance. And I want us to distinct, just so we'll know, that I want us to distinct between the state level and society level, because these are very different. These are obviously very different planes, but the strategies used are different in these two levels. Extremely interesting. I don't want to get into this now, because I will get into that in the continuing of our session, or at the beginning of our next session. Regardless of how, that's the last one I'll take now. Regardless of how we label it, what are ultra-Orthodox women actually working towards? Is it inclusion in the public sphere, or is it more about being able to live their lives with less restrictions? Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you were seeing the questions with me. I'll do it slowly from now on. I'm sorry. So regardless of how we label it, Clara says, what are ultra-Orthodox women actually working towards? Is it inclusion in the public sphere, or is it more about being able to live their lives with less restrictions? So two comments for that. One, I'm not talking about the ultra-Orthodox women. I may be talking at times about the national ultra-Orthodox women. These are very different. In the ultra-Orthodox community in Israel, there is an evolving feminism also. It's very, very different in its characteristics. Just one example, ultra-Orthodox women do not have representation in the Knesset, okay, in the legislation, in the legislative branch, except for our new Minister for Diaspora, Omer Yankelevich, which is not from an ultra-Orthodox party, but in Kahol Lavan, and already a lot of people in the Haredi population say she's not really Haredi, she's not really ultra-Orthodox. And the question is, but at the end of the day, if you ask me about halachic feminists, whether it is more about being able to live their lives with less restriction or the public sphere, I would say both public sphere and their personal lives. And I think we'll see, let me think, I think we'll see, yeah, we'll see examples for both. In this in the next session. Okay, so it's good that you told me that the questions are too fast. I'm sorry for that, and hopefully next time will be better. I want us to continue. Let's see. Now we understand the activist's character, right? We have the connected critics, and you had so many wonderful questions because I didn't continue and talk about the strategies. So now we'll talk about the strategies they use. Okay, so the literature defines two strategies for struggle for social change: affirmation and transformation, also called evolution and revolution. I'll use affirmation and transformation. Let's take a look. I need to share the sources again. Here it is. Let's take a look at source number 3. Nancy Fraser's From Redistribution to Recognition, Dilemmas of Justice in a Post-Socialist Age. So Nancy Fraser is a political philosopher, a critical theorist, a feminist. And here's what she has to say about affirmation and transformation. Let me begin by briefly distinguishing affirmation and transformation. By affirmative remedies for injustice, I mean remedies aimed at correcting inequitable outcomes of social arrangements without disturbing the underlying framework that generates them. By transformative remedies, in contrast, I mean remedies aimed at correcting inequitable outcomes precisely by reconstructing the underlying generative framework. The nub of the contrast is end state outcomes versus the processes that produce them. It is not gradual versus apocalyptic change. So in other words, affirmation promotes social change from within the existing social or institutional or legal framework. And in contrast, transformation aims at changing the existing social, institutional, or legal framework from its basis, from its core, and replace it with another, better framework. Let's go back to Fraser. This distinction can be applied, first of all, to remedies for cultural injustice. Affirmative remedies for such injustices are currently associated with mainstream multiculturalism. This proposes to redress disrespect by revaluing unjustly devalued group identities, while leaving intact both the contents of those identities and the group differentiations that underlie them. Transformative remedies, by contrast, are currently associated with deconstruction. They would redress disrespect by transforming the underlying cultural valuational structure, by destabilizing existing group identities and differentiations. These remedies would not only raise the self-esteem of members of currently disrespected groups, they would change everyone's sense of belonging, affiliation, and self. So, according to Fraser, affirmation tend to deepen and build upon existing distinctions between groups, whereas transformation tend to disrupt in the long term the stability of these distinctions in order to make room in the future to the creation of new groups. Think, for example, about the LGBTQ struggle. Affirmative strategy would focus on identity politics and recognition, for example, recognition in same-sex marriage. In contrast, transformative strategy would build on queer theory that aims at deconstructing the dichotomy between homosexual and heterosexual. So again, affirmation works within the existing order, whereas transformation aims at changing it altogether. Let's see how these strategies play out in the halachic feminist activity. I don't think I mentioned this before, and one of the questions reminded me that, but the halachic feminist struggle deals with a whole world of issues involving the status of women in Orthodox Judaism. It deals with the inequality, obviously, in marriage and divorce and everything that entails. Mainly, but not only, get recalcitrance. It deals with the opening of religious positions to women, with opening the rituals to meaningful women participation, with matters of body, of health, of sexuality matters, with the status of religious LGBTQ, and with sexual assault in the religious society or by spiritual leaders. Today, in what we have left, the time we have left, we'll take our example from the Jewish law regarding marriage and divorce. So I think I need to have some words of introduction, although I guess most of you know this, but just so we'll be all on the same page. According to Jewish law, marriage as a legal institution is a private, according to Orthodox Jewish law, marriage is a private contractual arrangement created by two unequal parties, the husband, Baal in Hebrew, which means owner, and the wife. Under this framework, divorce is executed by a writ of divorce called get, given willingly by the husband to the consenting wife, with no need for a formal decision by a religious authority. Even more than that, no religious authority is allowed to dissolve a valid matrimonial bond. Usually, the husband's voluntary provision of the get is an absolute prerequisite, and it's from the Oraita, meaning it is traced to the Torah, and without which the divorce is invalid. Conversely, the wife's consent is based on an edict issued by Rabbi Gershom in the 11th century, prohibiting husbands from divorcing their wives against their will. Rabbi Gershom's provision, while improving women's situation, is from the Rabbanan, meaning it is normatively weaker than the biblical command. It's from the rabbis. And there are a number of circumstances under which men are allowed to marry without a divorce, whereas women are never accorded this right. Moreover, A get given against the complete free will of the husband is a coerced get me'useh in Hebrew, and is void, whereas a get accepted by the wife without her complete free will is not necessarily invalidated. Furthermore, if a woman who has not been given a get bears children from another man, these children will be considered illegitimate, mamzerim. Mamzer is a status that is passed on through the generations and entails a number of sanctions in the ritual sphere and precludes those who hold this status from marrying within the Jewish community, except with converts or other mamzerim. By contrast, the children of a man who is not divorced suffer no religious stigma, since he only violates rabbinic decree rather than a biblical injunction. This unequal legal framework under which husbands cannot be forced to grant a get against their will and women suffer harsh consequences from failing to obtain the get opens the door to get recalcitrance by men. The possibility of get recalcitrance and the gendered power imbalance between men and women in Orthodox Jewish family law translates into monetary concessions from women, as well as pressure and even extortion by men in order to reach better divorce settlements. This problem is commonly called in Jewish law and society the aguna problem. Aguna, chained or anchored in Hebrew, is a woman who wishes to divorce but is unable to obtain a get. Now, historically, an aguna was a woman that her husband's whereabouts were unknown. Today, mostly, it is a woman whose husband refuses to release her from marriage. Either way, she is trapped in matrimony. Now, around the world, as you probably know, the legal framework of family Jewish law affects only those who see themselves committed to the Jewish law regardless of existing secular systems of the states regulating marriage and divorce. In Israel, however, the state has adopted the Orthodox Jewish law regarding marriage and divorce in statutory arrangements. Let's take a look at source number 4. That was too much. Source number 4, Rabbinical Courts Jurisdiction Marriage and Divorce Law from 1953. Matters of marriage and divorce of Jews in Israel, being nationals or residents of the state, I'm stopping because each and every word here is important, shall be under the exclusive jurisdiction of rabbinical courts. Section 2, marriages and divorces of Jews shall be performed in Israel in accordance with Jewish religious law, Orthodox Jewish religious law, meaning every Jewish person in Israel is obliged to get married and divorced exclusively consistent with Orthodox religious law and through the rabbinical institutions. And I would add to that, that's also according to the strictest interpretation of Orthodox religious law. Under this framework, the rabbinical court holds an enormous amount of power. Although the rabbinical court, the Beit Din, does not usually have the power to dissolve the marriage, they have the power to decide to compel and even coerce the husband to give the get by levying sanctions, either social sanctions such as shaming or statutory sanctions such as vehicle license revocation, prohibition on leaving the country, and even jail sentence. The problem is that Israeli rabbinical court is very conservative, most of the judges being from the ultra-Orthodox society, and it's just not using its power to free women. Really, the Israeli Beit Din is perceived highly discriminatory against women, although it doesn't have to be like that. So at least until now, Halachic feminists tried and are trying to change the Beit Din, the rabbinic courts, so that as many women as possible will have positions there and will influence on how it works. And again, until now, this effort is made on all fronts, except Dayanut, except religious judges. Remember this is extremely important point. So except in regards to the religious judges themselves. So we had To'anot Beit Din, rabbinic pleaders who represents the sides, because in rabbinical courts it doesn't have to be lawyers, and legal advisors to the judges, and the CEO of the rabbinical court system. All of these jobs were not open to women, and now they are. I'm thinking if we have time to continue more, or do we want to take more Q&As? No, I'll continue a bit more, and then I'll take Q&As and sum it up. I want to go back to our strategies. Remember, affirmation and transformation. A clear example of affirmation activity is the legislation of the amendment to the Dayanim law. The Dayanim, again, are the religious judges, and the amendment establishes an adequate representation for women in the Dayanim appointment committee. In a particularly speedy legislative process, in less than 2 months, this is really fast, an amendment to the Dayanim law was passed in June 2013. The amendment changed the composition of the committee for the appointment of Dayanim so that there are reserved seats for women within the members of the committee. Let's take a look. It's source number 5. I didn't give you here the bill itself because it is in an extremely legal language, but the explanatory notes are just as good for us, if not more. So this is the Dayanim Bill, Amendment number 26, Adequate Representation for Women in the Dayanim Appointment Committee. And so it says, 1, paragraph 6A of the Dayanim law from 1955 establishes that the committee for appointing Dayanim, here forward the committee, will be composed of 10 members, 2 chief rabbis, 2 Dayanim from the Rabbinic High Court, 2 ministers, one of whom must be the justice minister, 2 members of Knesset, and 2 representatives of the Lawyers Guild, the Lawyers Bar. This means that 4 members of the committee, the 2 chief rabbis and the Dayanim from the Rabbinic High Court, are men, have to be men, necessarily men. There are no clear statutory requirements to appoint women for any of the rest of the members. Now that's a nice understatement here. Actually, under the terms of the law, as it was before the amendment, a situation can be easily created where the committee will have no women serving as members at all, a situation that was supposed to happen in the committee that was scheduled to convene in December 2011. Going back to the bill, even though women are approximately 50% of the public who require the services of rabbinic courts, the judges are all men, making it critically important that they, women, should at least have proper representation on the selection committee. This proposal therefore suggests establishing as law that at least one of the 2 representatives on the committee from each government entity, the governing coalition, the Knesset, and the Lawyers Guild, must be a woman. Similarly, it proposes that the number of committee members be increased to 11, with the additional seat being filled by a rabbinic pleader who is a woman to be chosen by the authority for the advancement of the status of women. The law as passed determines that the rabbinic pleader will be chosen by the justice minister. So this amendment clearly represents the strategy of affirmation. Since there is a change, there will be women in the selecting committee, and we know that representation of women is important, but this change is clearly made within the existing order, both of halakha, because there's no halachic prohibition on being a part of an appointing committee, and of course, it does not interfere with the state's existing order of rabbinical courts and Jewish law and male dayanim. So the legislation regarding the Dayanim Appointment Committee represents the strategy of affirmation. In contrast, a struggle to establish a secular track of civil marriage in Israel reflects transformative activity. As you remember, the State of Israel grants exclusive authority to the rabbinical courts and the religious law regarding marriage and divorce. Establishing civil marriage in Israel alongside the religious law, the religious system, or in its place, providing an alternative normative framework for the social, religious, legal framework is a transformative action. I should say that this struggle is usually promoted by non-religious organizations, and halachic feminists rarely work toward this, both because of its slim prospects, and especially because this is an endeavor which is external to religion, meaning outside the normative cultural system in which halachic feminists are immersed in. Remember, the connected critics. So I think we're going to stop here today. Perhaps I'll see if we have any more questions or comments. Let's see. Marlene, I'll read them or no? Yeah.
Whatever you prefer.
Yeah.
Would you like me to read them?
No, that's okay. This is from Anis. Ultra-Orthodox women at the Kotel don't look like they want feminism as they push their rituals on non-Orthodox women. Could this be true? You're right. And that's not the case only for ultra-Orthodox women. A lot of women, and I think that we could see it also in Western society, are rejecting feminism. We can see again, even if we look at Western society in matters of body image. You're right, that's true, but that's not only the case with ultra-Orthodox women. I don't know if we'll get to the Kotel. Maybe write it down for me afterwards, or I don't know if you have any way of communication until Thursday. If you want me to touch upon the women of the wall, I'll try to do that. From Leslie. In the morning blessings, men say, thank you, Hashem, for not making me a woman. Can there be true equality between men and women in Judaism when this type of rhetoric is in our text? You're absolutely right. I know a lot of Orthodox women that changes this prayer, and they're saying, both men and women, saying, thank you for making me Israel. And there are actually really inspiring, I think, papers, tshuvot of women that are discussing this matter religiously. Dorothea, where in the Torah is the get addressed? What does it say exactly? I actually don't want to get into this right now. Because I think it would be too long, and I'm not proficient enough to say it in short. So perhaps I could refer you to an answer if you could send me the question. Laura, some rabbis here build into the ketubah, the husband's agreement for a get. Do they do that in Israel? Okay, short answer, yes. Long answer, not in rabbinical courts. There are many strategies that are trying to implement, many struggles that are trying to implement this exact strategy, whether by legislation, failed, by competing institutions that divorce of competing beidins. So that was the slightly longer answer. And I think this would be the last one for today by Nancy. Okay, okay, I see. It's just that I'll try to say something about Women Over the Wall, and I just want to sum up what we did today. So what we did today is learn about halachic feminism in Israel, what it is, how it developed, what are the characteristics of its social criticism, and we started talking about the strategies it uses. And as you might guess, we'll tend to think that halachic feminism, since it's a connected critics struggle, will use affirmation rather than transformation. In our next session in Thursday, I'd like to shuffle things out for a bit and seriously question this assumption. We'll continue our discussion on strategies. Each of them have advantages and disadvantages, and we'll talk about dynamics of change using and analyzing more examples. And I'd also like us to talk on a recent, I'll really try to talk about this. It's a recent development from a week and a half ago involving the exams of the rabbinate. That's something pretty amazing that's going on right now. So thank you. And thanks to our Hartman team in the background. Thank you, Marlene. And we'll meet again on Thursday. Good day or good night or